This entire video has been shot on a Canon 600D, and in this video I will be answering some questions like, is it any good for YouTube, or is it any good for taking images that will be printed later, or is it in any way good in 2020 right now? This is a classic shab review. So almost 1 year ago when I bought this camera, I was facing a hard decision whether to buy the Canon 600D or the Canon 1200D. And both cameras were close to each other, but in the end I bought the 600D, even though their prices were pretty similar. Now the Canon 600D or T3i was released in 2011, while the 1200D was released in 2014, which makes the 600D a little bit older. And the fact that the Canon 600D is 3 years older than the 1200D didn't make me go and buy the 1200D immediately. Instead, I started comparing the two and comparing them with other budget cameras, if you might call it, and to try to compare them in photo-wise and video-wise. Now, photo-wise or picture-wise, the Canon 600D has an 18 megapixel sensor, and it's pretty good, but comparing to the new cameras that might reach even 32 megapixels, it's considered to be a little bit old, but it's still good enough to print some medium-sized photos. And in my experience in taking photos with this camera, photos were almost always sharp and great, except for when shooting at night. At night, the camera doesn't perform very well because when you raise up the ISO, the photo starts to get really noisy, and the maximum ISO that I put that sounded so Canadian. The maximum number that I put when I'm shooting with this camera is 800 or 1600 ISO maximum. After that, the photos start getting really noisy and they would be just unprintable or unusable they would be. But all of that changed when I bought a new lens, the Canon Nifty 50 or the 50mm STM 1.8 lens. Using the Nifty 50 with any camera basically makes its photos go from one level to the other. Now, what's so special about this lens is that it has a wide aperture, 1.8. Unlike the kit lens, which has the widest aperture at 3.5, and when you zoom in, you would have a 5.6 aperture. Now, you have to know that the wider the aperture, the more light that goes in. And when you have more light, you don't have to raise your ISO. That way, you just widen the aperture and have clear pictures that doesn't have any noise. So the 50mm definitely changed the game for me when using the Canon 600D. And if we wanted to talk about the kit lens, the lens that comes with the Canon 600D, I would say that it's a pretty bad lens. Like I said, the widest aperture that this lens can go to is 3.5 at 18mm. Another thing is that the autofocus in this lens is really slow, and if you wanted to focus a little bit faster, you would have to focus through the viewfinder, and if you had to focus through the live view, it would be really slow. Video-wise, this camera is actually pretty good. It shoots the same video that the Canon 750D can shoot, which is 1080p 24 frames per second and 720p 60 frames per second, which means you can get a nice slow motion video at 40% speed. One thing you have to pay attention to when you are buying your Canon 600D is the kit lens that comes with it. When I bought my camera, I got this lens, and this is the Canon 18-55mm, no STM, which means that it makes a lot of noise when it focuses. Unlike the lens that I'm shooting with right now, that when I focused you didn't almost hear anything because it's an STM lens. So the big difference between this lens and this lens is the focusing noise, the speed of focus, and actually the sharpness of the pictures. This lens doesn't give as much sharp photos as the STM one, and I would recommend to buy the STM immediately if you had the choice between an STM and a normal 18-55 lens. Another thing to pay attention to is that the old Canon 18-55mm lens doesn't have stabilizer built in, unlike the STM that has image stabilization built in the lens. And when shooting video with the Canon 600D, you won't have autofocus. You would only be able to use manual focus or to focus and set the focus at whatever you focused on, like I'm doing right now. So it doesn't follow my face. If I moved, if I came closer, if I went far away, I would still be out of focus. One of the last things I want to talk about is few points to compare between the 600D and the 1200D. If we wanted to compare the 600D to the 1200D, we would find that they are pretty much the same in specs. The 600D might be a little better in specifications, but the major big difference that we find is the flip screen, which makes you vlog like I'm doing right now, see what you are shooting with. If you wanted to take a photo from like a point of view that's up, you would just tilt the screen and see what you are shooting. Same goes if you're shooting from down. And so the flip screen is a really important point for me because I always shoot from unusual angles, you might say. And because I shoot videos facing the camera, like a vlogger style. Another thing that we will see is that the Canon 600D has a mic port, which means that you can plug in your microphone immediately to the camera. But I wouldn't recommend that because basically the audio chip in the camera isn't that good. And if I wanted to record audio, I would normally record them on my mobile phone like I'm doing right now. The Canon 1200D, on the other hand, doesn't have a microphone port, which might make a difference for some people, but not for me. So in the end, if you wanted an answer to the question, is the Canon 600D any good for YouTube? The answer is kinda, because it has a flip out screen, but it doesn't have autofocus. If that was an important thing for you, I would recommend the 250D. It's a new camera that has autofocus, and basically it's better than the 600D. The only time that I would recommend the Canon 600D for someone is if they don't have enough money and they want to buy a camera just to learn about photography and to learn how to deal with lenses and how to shoot video maybe for the first time. Then I might recommend the Canon 600D, and I would say that it might be a good choice. Other than that, the Canon 600D is getting old and it's not that great in 2020, except for someone who knows how to use it actually. And with that being said, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, comment, share and subscribe to this channel to see more videos like this one. See you.